So, carb intake. What is your job? How much do you need per person? And this varies a lot based on your height, your weight, and your muscle mass. However, what I like to do is use what's called slice of bread equivalents. This is actually something that I made up myself. But basically what you do is you visualize a slice of bread and how big that might be. And you visualize any other type of carb. It could be pasta or rice or any type of grain or oatmeal. And if that is the same size as a slice of bread, so for example, you have pasta and the pasta is just about the same size as the slice of bread, it's going to have just about the same amount of calories. So that's a slice of bread equivalent. It could be a slice of bread equivalent of oatmeal or so on. Essentially around 15 grams, maybe up to 25 at the most. That's a slice of bread equivalent. So what you want is never below 1 per meal and having it 3 times a day, 3 meals a day. And if you do that and you have 1 slice of bread equivalent, that's kind of at the low end of the scale. That's for probably someone who weighs a low amount and who's looking also to lose fat. But it's also usually not a good idea to go more than 3 slice of bread equivalents per meal, except on cheat meals, and that is once every, could be 3-4 days. You'll have 1 meal if you need it in order to refill your glycogen. If you happen to feel slightly off, like you might have gone too low, you can then have a cheat meal where at that time you do go over 3 slice of bread equivalents. Another thing that you can do is test urinary ketones. That's something that we do at our clinic, and that kind of tells us, have you gone too low? For example, someone might be on 1 slice of bread equivalent per meal, and that happens to be too low for them. So what we can do is test the urinary ketones, and if they show up or if there's too many, then we can assess, do we need to add some more carbs in? And also you can assess your own symptoms. You should feel great. There's no reason for you to have symptoms for any type of diet. And this should be eliminating symptoms, making you feel great, but at the same time helping you get lean and toned. So we're moving into part 2, which is optimizing hormones. And first we're going to talk about insulin, and you might recognize that from people who have diabetes. They have an impairment of insulin metabolism, but insulin is actually for everyone. And when anyone eats any type of carbohydrate, and it doesn't matter what type of carb it is, it could be just a simple sugar, it could be a white bread or a white pasta, or it could be a whole grain bread or whole grain pasta, or any type of carb at all. Whenever you eat carbs, your body converts it into sugar in the bloodstream eventually. And when the body senses that the sugar in the bloodstream is too high, which is any time you eat carbs at all, it will secrete insulin. And the insulin's job is to latch onto that sugar that's in the bloodstream and carry it away. And carry it to, remember how we were saying it could be right into the cells for immediate energy, or it could be right into your glycogen stores, the short-term energy stores, or it could be into the long-term adipose tissue, so the long-term fat storage. So in other words, insulin helps to grow fat tissues. It's kind of like the booster of tissues. And the other thing that it does is helps to grow muscle tissues. So insulin is kind of 2 sides of a coin, where you want to be on one side. You want it to use it to grow your muscles or to keep them from shrinking at least, but you don't want it to contribute to fat storage. So when you eat any type of protein, this also gets broken down, and protein gets broken down into amino acids. So if you recall, I just said that any type of carb gets broken down into sugars in the bloodstream. Well, any type of protein gets broken down into amino acids. So amino acids are essentially the equivalent of sugars, but they're actually the building blocks of proteins rather than carbs. So when there are amino acids in the bloodstream, meaning you just ate protein, at the same time that there are excess sugars, meaning that you just had carbs, then insulin takes both of them and it creates a significant amount of muscle. And this is why we have the rule of always eat carbs and proteins together. So the reason being is you have, let's say, carbs and insulin is secreted. You don't want it to only take the carbs in your bloodstream. You don't want it to only take the sugars and convert them into fats. You want it to have amino acids because the amino acids will help create muscle growth, create lean tissue. So that, remember back to that, the difference between the two women who had both lost weight at the beginning of this presentation. If you want to look more like the second woman, more lean and toned, then you're going to want to have protein at the same time as your carbs, and that's what'll do it. So how does excess food get stored? So for example, if you have carbs alone, excess carbs, that gets stored as fat. If you have excess fat alone, also fat. If you have excess protein alone, now this is kind of interesting, that also gets stored as fat. And then if you have protein and fat, also fat, fat and carbs, this is the most amount of fat if you have fat and carbs together. So be careful with eating, for example, pastries or muffins, because those have fat and carbs at the same time. So remember my scenario of the insulin grabbing onto amino acids. Well, in this case, if you're having fat and carbs at the same time, the insulin grabs onto the fat. So it grabs onto not only the sugars, but the fat at the same time, which makes it the most amount of fat. And then the last two, this is where you really want to be, protein and carbs at the same time. This spurs on at least much more muscle growth. It might have a little bit of fat growth as well, but much more muscle. And also protein, carbs, and fat at the same time. That'll help spur muscle and fat, but you don't have to worry too much about fat growth at that point, because you also have calories burning at all times. You have a basal metabolic rate, which means that even if you're just sitting around or laying around, you are burning calories. So you are able to eat some fats and some carbs, and they won't get stored as fat because you're using them up regularly. Okay, we're talking about now choosing the right fats. And there are 5 overall categories of fat. There are omega-3s, 6s, 9s. Those are your unsaturated fats. And then there's the saturated fat and trans fats. So those are the 5 categories. First one we're going to talk about is what to avoid. And the main thing that you want to avoid is trans fats. Trans fats are highly heated and processed, enough so that they're usually L-shaped molecules. This is getting a little science-y. But what it means is that fat molecules are most often occurring in L shapes, or just kind of like a curve. So if you take a look at my screen right here, you might have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and molecules kind of going up and down the curve here and coming along the edge of my hand here. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then there's a little split at this little place at the middle. Now, if they get highly heated and processed, like they are in trans fats, all of a sudden that heat just kind of straightens it out, and all of a sudden the fat molecule looks like this, and your body does not understand what this means. It's a totally straight fat molecule, and because your body has never seen it before, doesn't know what it is, doesn't know where to store it, you become more unhealthy when you consume trans fats. For example, in monkey studies, trans fat intake was highly correlated to abdominal fat storage and insulin resistance, even in the absence of excess calories, meaning that the monkeys were not eating too much, however they were still getting fat in their abdominal areas. They were still getting more belly fat than they should, and they weren't eating too much. So it was the trans fats that were doing it. So in order to avoid trans fat, you should be avoiding all deep fried foods and avoiding hydrogenated oils. So essentially take a look at the ingredients on the back of anything that you might buy and make sure that there are no oils that are listed as hydrogenated. Sometimes it's called partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated. Doesn't matter what it is. If it says hydrogenated, that's the one that you want to avoid, because that means that it has some amount of trans fat. And sometimes it even says 0 trans fat on the label, but if it says hydrogenated, then it probably has some. It has probably less than 0.49 grams, but even 0.49 grams is too much. You want to avoid all of it.